mostly going to be talking about redistribution today, and sort of crime is less of a side of what I'm going to be talking with you about today. However, that is because this is a very kind of dense and rich project. There are three sides to it, as you will see in a second. There is one that has to do with choices about redistribution and what influences redistribution. There is a second one that has to do with crime and policing as a reaction to inequality and redistribution. And then there is also a third thing that I'm also going to just very briefly sort of mention, which has to do with the relationship between a kind of a survey-related side of what our analysis does, and the lab experiment. And sort of we can see both a kind of survey side and a lab experiment side. Motivation for this project, essentially, I'm interested, for those of you who have followed my work, I'm interested in equality of opportunity, equality of outcome related topics. This is the work that I'm also doing with Verena Fetscher. And of course, for those of you who read my book with Daniel Steckmüller and sort of the related articles, we do have an implicit argument in the book about what is it about inequality that sort of influences the potential for crime as a negative externality of inequality, and what about this kind of trade-off about choosing redistribution or crime and policing. And that's what sort of this project is all about, sort of theoretically. All right. This either doesn't work or I don't know how to use it. And this is also not responding. Great, thank you. So yes, so today mostly about this side of things that have to do with, I think, essentially sort of four main ideas. One has to do with income and sort of an income-dependent side of choices about redistribution. One having to do with what we call in this project asymmetry or procedural unfairness. Sort of, is there something about the system that I'm in that makes outcomes more or less fair? And then a third one that has to do with the difference between effort, work versus talent or merit. And then the fourth one that is about beliefs and sort of how do beliefs about how I would have done in a sort of a fair system influence sort of whether I either sort of support redistribution or not. So I'm going to give you some sort of brief set of intuitions and kind of the driving theoretical hypothesis that we have, particularly about the redistributive side of our sort of empirical project. Then I will really sort of spend more time talking about exactly what we do in the lab, in sort of the experimental design and how we do that. I will present some really sort of preliminary results. This is a 3-lab project. We've done Essex and we have done Nottingham. We're still sort of missing Oxford, which we hopefully will do sometime this month or next month. And then if time allows, I will talk to you about the sort of the second side of this, which goes on sort of after redistribution, which is about crime as a choice for the poor and policing as a choice for the rich. All right, so I'm going to not spend that much time in some of the theoretical intuitions, but do feel free to sort of interrupt or bring them up sort of later in the Q&A if something is not clear. We start from, again, sort of a very sort of common sort of baseline. Imagine that sort of material self-interest is the only thing that matters, and it is a very kind of Meltzer-Richard sort of way of thinking. Okay, your income then would be correlated with your support for redistribution. The richer you are, the more your support, the more you pay for redistribution, the less you get from it, and therefore the lower your, if that's the only thing that matters, the lower your redistribution preferences. And if you're the poor and you mostly benefit, you pay less than you get from redistribution, then your support for redistribution would be higher. In this sort of world, then sort of there would be no fairness, but only sort of, again, sort of to the extent that there are sort of possible sort of distortionary sort of effects of taxation. But things like, as in the introduction, that have to do with some sort of normative conception of fairness wouldn't necessarily be part of this. And I don't know, okay, so then, but we know, of course, from the literature, both in political economy, in comparative politics, and economics, that this material self-interest side is not the only thing that matters, and that there are, in fact, sort of that if this was the only thing that mattered, the poor would sort of uniformly support redistribution in a way that we see they don't, and the rich would uniformly oppose redistribution in a way that we see they don't. And fairness or fairness-related arguments have been presented as a possible explanation of why that may be the case. And the very simple idea here is that if that people, even if they're poor, may be more willing to accept inequality if they think that this is a result of a fair meritocratic process that rewards effort and or merit. And others, even when they're rich, may in fact support redistribution if they believe inequality is the result of some sort of an unfair sort of luck-based rather than effort, work, or merit process. But of course, the question is what is fair? And in there, of course, then we also have a lot of work in terms of what a fair system could be, and whether, in fact, this kind of equality of opportunity, having a system that equalizes opportunity for people, would then, of course, diminish support for outcome redistribution, because then inequality would be perceived as the outcome of a fair system. So there is quite a bit of research on this. I'm just mentioning very briefly some of the things. There is a general consensus in some of this literature that a fair distribution of income when there is a meritocratic process is something that then sort of influences redistribution for preferences. People more likely to accept inequality if they believe that inequality is the outcome of a fair meritocratic process that rewards this talent, ambition, and hard work related things. Now, sort of just as a very sort of brief aside, it is in fact the case that in much of this literature, some outcomes like intergenerational mobility, or what we could define as an outcome, intergenerational mobility, is in fact either sort of a reflection or a proxy for fairness or equality of opportunity, so that if we see high levels of mobility, then we conclude there must be equality of opportunity. But it is in fact not always the case that this outcome fairness and procedural fairness would be correlated, and we may get sort of fair outcomes from unfair procedures and the other way around. So that's something that we try to look at. So what are we interested in doing? So what are the things that we are going to then sort of try to get at through our lab experiment? So we have, again, sort of four main ideas. One is that there may be an income-dependent effect of fairness, and that fairness may matter differently to the rich and to the poor. And this is something that then sort of emerges from my work with Daniel Steckmuller, in which we do find this sort of consistent effect using observational data of the rich being much more affected by things that could possibly be related to fairness and altruism, etc., than the poor. Then that there is something about procedural unfairness that we want to capture as a symmetry, in the sense that, again, sort of as I will explain in more detail in a second, than when two people interact and they have produced sort of their endowments following different rules, their support for distribution may in fact reflect the unfairness of a procedure that allows some people to get their endowment one way and some people to get their endowment in a different way. Then the third idea that I also briefly mentioned before is that there may be a difference, and there is a difference between work as effort, right? Sort of something that we have engaged in and that is different from not doing work, and that should be rewarded, versus merit or talent, which is that we did work, but now somehow the endowment that we get is in fact sort of related to how well we did, or some talent or some merit related to that work. And then we want to sort of finally kind of try to be able to distinguish between the fairness of the system and the fairness of an outcome in a way that takes into consideration sort of your beliefs, in the sense of sort of whether you thought that you would end up where you ended up anyways, even if the system is fair, or the other way around. All right, so let me again sort of very briefly sort of work through these 4 ideas. The first one, which is the one that is related to the work that I've done with Daniel and the work that I've done with Verena, has to do with the fact that fairness, since it is connected to, in some ways, concern for others, but also concern for sort of some sort of procedural justice to myself, may be something that is more important to the rich than to the poor, because for the poor, again, sort of as we show in our book and in our articles, the concrete materials of interest benefits of redistribution may be very obvious, and then sort of materials of interest trumps any other consideration. There is much more variation in terms of the support for distribution among the rich. So for the poor, luck, merit, or effort do not matter as much as for the rich. Is something that we want to explore in this laboratory setting, which is sort of taken away from the more observational stuff I've done with Daniel. So then the first sort of hypothesis, which is sort of the one that is commonly in the literature, of course, is that we are going to observe in the lab that the poor have higher support redistribution, that have a higher level of support redistribution than the rich. That would be sort of not in any way sort of spectacular. It just confirms what many people have found. But we would find also that these other things that we are throwing into the lab experiment that have to do with fairness or work or merit, right, are going to make the variation for the support of redistribution among the rich much higher than for the poor. That we're going to see more variance in terms of the rich than for the poor. So that's the first thing that we are going to try to sort of explore. The second thing is this procedural unfairness as asymmetry. And in here, what we're saying is that in almost all the literature that we have looked into, the idea that either luck or effort matter differently to people's support for redistribution is done in sort of an asymmetric way, so that people interact with each other, for example, the rich and the poor, and they choose redistribution. But in fact, what they do is they have their endowments produced in an equal way, so that it is not often the case. I think that we've found sort of one article in which there is a very sort of clearly asymmetric setup. It is always the case that we will show, right, sort of the work has shown that people are much more likely to support redistribution when they perceive the outcomes to be the result of luck rather than effort. But that's because either both participants or as in a spectator, sort of the 2 participants that did this did the same kind of luck-related thing, or the same kind of effort-related thing, or the same kind of combination of effort and luck. So we want to consider fairness sort of more realistically. We would argue to be related to whether a system treats individuals differently, and some acquire endowments through effort, but some may inherit their endowment, and therefore that would make a difference then in terms of the support for distribution. So we try then to have this measure of the effect of asymmetric unfair systems, and we can separate the way that one earns and the other earns, and if that makes a difference to the outcome. Akbas, Ariely, and Yüksel is in fact the article that we've seen that has a very sort of explicit asymmetric side of this, but they do something very different from what we do, and it's not really sort of similar to what we do. But they justify it in a very similar way, in the sense that they think asymmetry is procedural unfairness. Let's see if it makes us a difference to how people behave. All right, so this is the second hypothesis, which would, again, sort of translating these intuitions would mean that sort of we would see that in fact there is an unfairness about asymmetry that makes people support redistribution more, and with always sort of with all these things we connect them to the income dependent initial expectation, and that these things are going to be stronger for the rich than they are for the poor. Distinguishing 2 dimensions of fairness, again, sort of we want to see whether it is effort and work that people want to reward, and then therefore you deserve your endowment if you've done work, or I deserve my endowment more if I have done more work, and therefore my redistributive choices are going to be affected by that. There is quite a lot about fairness in the comparative political economy literature having to do with redistribution preferences that has been coming out in the last few years. I'm just mentioning some of the things in this slide, but I think in many of these contributions, there isn't really a clear distinction between work and merit. And in some ways, both work and merit are sort of identified with the same thing that will then produce something that affects redistribution preferences. So our expectation is, once again, that somehow, okay, effort matters, and if effort matters, therefore, sort of, I am going to be more likely to feel I deserve my endowment if I have worked for it, and therefore my redistribution preferences will be a reflection of that, and that this would matter more to the rich. Merit. So we have an expectation that I will then sort of think I deserve my endowment more if I've worked for it. I will feel that you deserve more if you have done work for your endowment. A similar logic could be applied to merit. If we have both worked, but then sort of one of us works but gets the endowment out of luck, one of us works and gets their endowment out of merit, that there could be something about rewarding talent in this setup that then would also affect redistribution preferences. But there is a kind of, right, sort of the difficulty that we find, and sort of when we show you some of our preliminary results, you will see this, is that merit is a little more complicated than effort, and that merit is somehow also more clearly related to whether, in fact, you had beliefs about how you would have done in the existence or absence of fairness. So effort seems much more unproblematic. You either came in and you did work, or you came in later and you didn't do work, and now we're going to sort of react to that. Merit seems to imply a lot of, but I was not allowed to get my endowment out of merit. I did work, and I would have done very well, and I would have been rich, but I didn't because I got my endowment out of luck. And now, how do I compare that? Or I know what the task was. I did the beginning sort of to know how I would have done the task, but I didn't do any work at all. And then I got completely out of luck without doing any work or any merit. I was as by luck poor, but I would have been very rich had I been given the opportunity. So that we then need to put together with a kind of measurement of beliefs, and we can do that in our setup because we do measure people's expectation of how they would have done in this particular effort task. So we will talk about that a little more, and this has a lot to do with this fourth side of things, which is that unfair systems can produce outcomes that participants believe are fair, right? So you think that you would have done a particular way, you are in an unfair system, but you ended up in the same place, and your attitude is going to therefore be different in terms of the support for distribution that you have, and the other way around. So we measure beliefs about performance, and we see whether this, in fact, affects support for distribution or not. And the hypothesis here is, again, sort of relatively straightforward in the sense that the rich, by luck, who thought they would do well, think that they deserve to be rich, and that the outcome is fair, and therefore they would have sort of low redistribution, so that the outcome is fair even though the procedure was not fair, and therefore my support for distribution would be affected by that. The poor by luck, who thought they would do badly, think they deserve to be poor, and that the outcome is fair even though the procedure was not fair, and they would have sort of lower redistribution. Okay, so now let me pause for a second and talk about the experimental design. These are the things that are theoretically guiding us. We have these intuitions about what these relationships are going to be. And now we want to do it in an experimental way because there are disadvantages to doing it in a lab experiment rather than looking at observational data or doing it in some sort of a survey experimental way. So we have two stages. So there is an online survey that our participants do, in which we ask a number of things, the kind of socioeconomic background related things that would matter. But we also ask them about redistribution preferences, like they would be asked in the European Social Survey. We ask them about a number of things that then we're interested in knowing whether your existing predispositions as expressed in a survey are going to influence your lab behavior. Because of course, in many ways, the way that we think about lab experiments is that we are creating artificially something that is actually going to influence people enough so that they react to the lab circumstances in a way that is not determined by somehow their pre-existing predispositions, right? So that it is going to matter that I'm rich or poor in the lab. It is going to matter because it comes with an economic sort of cost and benefit, whether I choose a higher or lower level of redistribution. If it was fully determined by the fact that ideologically, before in a survey 2 weeks before, I either say I'm left or right, or I'm pro-redistribution or anti-redistribution, that would be something interesting for us to show or to discover or to find. All right. So we have this experiment. I think that perhaps the best way is to sort of go step by step. It is this kind of 3 by 3 by 2 full factorial design. These subjects are matched in pairs, the sort of the rich and the poor. And we have done 2 sessions, Essex, 366 participants, Nottingham, 318, and then Oxford still to come. This is what the redistribution looks like, but I think it's better if I just sort of go into this in this kind of more step-by-step detailed way. So 2/3 of the session, 2/3 of the people that are in a particular session are what we can call efforts. There are people who are going to do the effort task. And they are admitted to the lab. And then there is 1/3 of the session that are the givens. The people who are going to come in, they're not going to do the effort task. They're going to be given an endowment not having done the effort or the work. And they enter sort of 30 minutes later, and therefore they're not waiting and then participating, to not have sort of a perception in some ways that waiting is work, and now I'm doing something that is work, but it's not fun, and because they're doing something else. So that this is the way that we have been doing it. The efforts are told that they'll be working on a job for 15 minutes, and afterwards, half will be paid by performance and half of them will be paid by luck. So we have now these 3 different sort of treatments. We have an effort talent or effort merit side of things, 1/3. We have an effort luck side of things, the second third. And then we have the given part. They didn't do the effort. They come in. They have their endowments given by luck. If you are then sort of rich, you get 80 ECUs. If you're poor, you get 20. So prior to the full work period, they have 30 seconds to practice, to sort of know what the effort task is and how then sort of they would do, because we're going to ask them once they do the 30 seconds, how do you think you would have done, or how do you think you will do after doing this for 15 minutes? So we have these beliefs about performance that are elicited because we tell them, right? So if you are in the group that is merit related, right? So half the people that have the highest score are going to be rich, half the people are going to be poor. Half the people that did better are going to get 80. The people that did worse are going to get 20 ECUs. Rich, poor, completely dependent on that merit side. All right. So the effort tasks that we have, we really sort of, I mean, there is no perfect effort task, and it's sort of always sort of complicated to know exactly sort of what effort task one should do. The one that we decided upon was something that we call sort of toss the trash. It is a sort of a computer. It's meant to feel like work rather than sort of a game. It is quite long and tedious. This is what it looks like. There is this trash points that you have there. There is a bin. The bin is small. You grab each of these points and take them to the bin. If you fail to put it inside the bin, then it goes back to the place where it came from and you have to do it again. For each of the pieces of trash you successfully put in the bin, you get 1 point. And the scores for the efforts, the people that actually did it for 15 minutes, ranges between 100 and 729. So someone did this in 15 minutes, 729 times. It's so, and the mean is 474. This is what they did. And 15 minutes is a long time. So after the 15 minutes, the remaining participants are introduced in the session. These are the givens, right, who have been sort of outside and sort of then sort of come in. They're given the 30 seconds to practice the effort task so they know what the other people have been doing. And also they have an impression, they're elicited their belief of how they would have done had they done the effort task. Okay? And the participants are then informed of the earnings. So people that did the effort then are divided into two groups. They didn't know that there were going to be effort luck or effort merit to begin with. So everyone does the effort not knowing whether they're going to be in the merit or effort or the luck sides. Then some of then if you've done the effort and are in the effort luck third of the session, then you are randomly divided into rich and poor. If you're in the effort merit side, then your score is what tells you whether you are rich or poor, if you're better or worse than sort of the two halves. And if you're the given, you've done the practice, but then you are given your endowment randomly. You're either rich or poor. All right? Is that relatively clear? So we have now these three groups in the lab. There are effort luck, effort merit, and givens, the people that didn't do an effort and they just are given the. All right. So these are some of the numbers, sort of 83%, many of them, think that they'll be top for performers. So they all think that they would have been better than sort of than the other half. 40% believe that the real effort task is more luck than effort. This is one of the issues that we have with effort tasks, right? Sort of, we want something that people will interpret as effort and work. But of course, anything that we can come up with is also partly related to luck, because by luck, you could be someone who is very patient. By luck, you could be someone who has very good hand-eye coordination. By luck, you could be someone who knows math. By luck, you could be. So 40% believe that is more like 42% that is more effort than luck. That's the. All right. So then the distribution part comes in, which is the one that really care about, right? So now we have a rich and a poor person are put together, and you are reminded of the process so that you have a refreshment of what's a situation. So you can read it right there. Recall that you were paid 80 ECUs and your counterpart was paid 20 ECUs. Your counterpart did work on the 15 minutes towards the task. Your counterpart was paid based on their job performance. So now you know you're interacted with someone who did the effort, the work, and someone who also was paid as merit, and you know your own because you did it yourself. Then you, in the event proposed rate is selected, the level of redistribution would you prefer? So you are asked to choose a level of taxation. So that is the level that you could choose 0%, and that means that you would keep your endowment, your counterpart would keep their endowment, and there would be no tax transfer sort of that. You could choose 100%, and if it was 100%, then your endowment and the endowment on your counterpart would be put together and divided by 2, and then you get sort of the same equal. So you have complete sort of equality between you and your partner, and those are the choices that you have in between the 0 and the 100. So this is then sort of related to sort of what we find, what we start to find in terms of redistribution. Materials of interest matter. So in a sort of very expected way, right? Sort of if you are rich, you support much less redistribution than if you are poor in the lab. And we do have also a significant difference in terms of the variance. And it is the case that, in fact, there is more variation in terms of redistribution preferences by the rich than by the poor. So that there is both then sort of the general kind of Meltzer-Richards sort of income effect, but also some sort of income-dependent sort of variability going on here that may, in fact, be affected by this effort and fairness-related things. I have a comment on the thing, but I don't know. Is it from Noah? Noah, you want to say something? Jump in.
It's just that it's the standard deviation on the graph, and I mislabeled it. So if anybody's wondering why those numbers don't look larger, it's just because it's the square root of the variance to make the graph look nicer.
All right. Okay. Then we have asymmetry, right? So in here, what we have is either symmetric pairs or asymmetric pairs. And symmetric pairs means the endowment was produced the same way by two people interacting, Asymmetric means there is a difference in terms of the way that we produced our endowment. Yeah. Did I? Oops. Sorry. So what we see here is that asymmetry matters, but only to the rich, right? So when we look at all, there are no differences. When we look at the poor, they have high levels of the redistribution demand, and it doesn't make much of a difference whether they're in asymmetric or symmetric pairs. When we look at the rich, it does make a difference, and as expected, they are reacting to procedural injustice in the sense that if a rich person is in an asymmetric pair, their support for distribution will be higher. Okay, then we have, where does this sort of, when we enter into sort of looking at effort and merit-related factors more in detail, where do these come from? We have an effort-related expectation. Does your own effort matter to your support for distribution? And in here, we are going to find that selfish effort matters, but only to the rich. This is all, and we can compare two sides of things. Either you did effort or you didn't do effort, or we could also compare luck only, right? You did effort and luck, or you did luck. So that we're not comparing, on the left side, we're comparing the two sides that did effort with the side that did luck. In the right side of this graph, what we're comparing is effort luck with luck. So, but we find the same thing here. For the rich, once again, the selfish effort doesn't matter. You always support high levels of redistribution. Whether you have yourself done effort or not is not very important, but it does make a difference to the rich when we look at the all rather than sort of the luck only, so that once you do support redistribution more when you have not done effort, and therefore sort of you feel less deserving of your endowment. In terms of merit, so sorry, we do the same thing with others' effort. So others' effort, so there is my own effort, there is your effort. Do I recognize your effort in my support for distribution? Once again, sort of others' effort matters, but only to the rich. No effect for all, no effect for poor. And in here we have an effect of other mattering and making my support for redistribution higher when I'm rich, whether I am in the comparison between effort, no effort, or I'm in the comparison of effort, luck, and luck. Merit doesn't matter. So the thing that we find is that the results for merit are, if we just look at merit in a sort of uncomplicated way like this, they only matter very marginally, and in fact, sort of in many ways, they don't seem to have the effect. There is much more about effort than there is about merit, but of course, there is the complication that I announced at the beginning, that merit is complicated because it involves beliefs about performance, so that luck can produce the outcome that I believe merit would have produced. And this is something that we want to take into consideration. And therefore, we look at beliefs about fairness of outcome. So the idea here, just to sort of remind you, is that unfairness is only relevant if it leads to a different outcome than the one people believe to be fair, and that the effects of beliefs, what we want here, sort of what we're going to be looking at, is that we think that the effects of beliefs will be most clear in the luck treatment, because then there is neither realized merit, right? Because you have not done the effort, therefore merit. And also there is no effort but luck that would influence your the effect of your beliefs on your support for distribution. So that's what we do here. We only compare the people in the treatment that are sort of the givens, the people that got, that didn't do the effort. So they did the task for 15 seconds just to know how they would do. They were elicited their beliefs, but then they didn't do the task. They were just given their endowment by tree. And here what you see is that these beliefs do have an effect in terms of the support for distribution. And again, sort of, you can see sort of the expectation here. The hypothesis were, if poor by luck, but believe I would have been rich by merit, then it's an unfair system that would mean high redistribution. That's what we see there in the poor side. If rich there by luck, but believe I would have been poor by merit, then that means there is an unfair system and would have high redistribution. And that's what we see sort of for the rich on that side. All right. These are very sort of preliminary ways of looking at our data. We can, of course, then sort of do it in a more sophisticated way. We're thinking about how would be sort of more illustrative and interesting to do these things. It's not clear. We haven't really sort of done any of that systematic sort of analysis yet. And we also sort of will wait until we have the Oxford side of things and see if that sort of makes any difference. But one of the things that we are interested in is to see in a very preliminary way if there is a correlation between the things that people responded to in the survey and the way that they behave in the lab. So this is what we do here. And out of sort of all the variables, the things that they have answered in the survey, the ones that I have in these results that I'm going to show you are gender, a risk measure, that is this sort of chosen gamble in the Eckel-Grossman sort of task. There is a measure of altruism, that is the amount sent in this sort of dictator game. There is then political ideology that we ask them to define themselves as left or right. There is a vote question, and just to simplify things here, I just have a vote labor sort of dummy in this analysis. There is present income that we ask for them. Does your income in real life that you told us about sort of 2 weeks ago influence your behavior in the lab when you are then sort of in the lab, poor or rich? We have a kind of a future income question as well. Sort of, do you think in a year from now you are going to be either living comfortably if you or not? And we have the survey redistribution preference question that you would have sort of in the European Social Survey, which is the government in the UK should take measures to reduce differences in income levels. And does that kind of redistribution preference influence your lab? And what we see here is that we have a sort of own effort, other effort results that confirm the things that I've shown you before. There is no merit one, but again, sort of that's because we don't have sort of the beliefs thing. The symmetry effect goes away because, again, it's more complicated once we are in fact counting for a number of the things that either imply own or other effort here. So you don't need to sort of think about that. Gender doesn't influence the outcome. The risk-loving side does affect redistribution preferences choices in the lab. So this measure, so those people who are risk-loving have lower support for redistribution, and that is both for the rich and for the poor. Altruism only matters to the rich. So this altruism measure that we have in the survey only matters to the rich when they come to the lab, and that is very sort of consistent with what Daniel and I found in our support for distribution observational side using ESS and GSS data. Political ideology doesn't matter. Vote labor doesn't matter. Present income doesn't matter. And the future income only matters to the rich, increasing sort of the level of support for distribution. How much time do I have, Marius?
5 minutes or so.
All right. So a super fast crime and redistribution, crime and policing thing. So one of the things that really interests us in this project, but of course, now I'll get to talk about it only for 5 minutes or less, is whether people's choices in terms of redistribution and whether the existing level of redistribution influences then the likelihood of the poor to engage in crime and the likelihood of the rich to invest in policing. So what we do is have this surprise second stage in our lab experiment now, in which people didn't know this. They didn't choose the redistributive levels based on the idea that they knew that there was going to be a crime and policing side. This would be sort of an obvious thing that we would want to do in the future if we, again, sort of get money to sort of run some of these things and start sort of playing with some of the things that we want to play with, but we need more money for. And we would actually make sort of this a stage that is known. But right now, you have made your redistributive choices, and now you're told, hey, there is a second stage of this. You now are going to be facing the following sort of circumstances. So we have a choice for the low-income people, the people who are poor in the previous stage, about stealing from the rich or not. And we have a choice for the rich of protecting themselves by investing in policing, and therefore increasing the probability that the poor are going to be caught if they steal from you. That's essentially sort of what we are doing. Theoretically, we think that the factors that affect this, the primary hypothesis, right, sort of the redistributive choices, are going to influence the crime or policing set of choices. So that, in fact, in some ways, you choose a legitimate, acceptable level of redistribution in the first stage, and now there is going to be an effect, and that contained in some ways your preferences in terms of whether effort should be rewarded, whether merit should be rewarded or not, your beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And now the question is going to be, was the redistribution level either enforced or the one that your partner chose, are they going to affect your chances of either stealing or investing in policing? So this is what we do. There is this setup that we have in which the rich choose these 3 discrete levels of policing, either none, low, or high. The cost is proportional. There is sort of this level of effectiveness that goes up the more you invest in policing, from 5% to 55% probability of catching the person if they decide to steal from you. And these are the choices that people have. They don't obviously have the knowledge about whether the other person or the other person will do, but they do have this knowledge about their what implications their choice of policing would have. And then there is also the stealing side, in which the poor, if they try to steal and get caught, would lose part of the endowment, sort of a significant part of their endowment. And there is then a probability that they know is going to be correlated with the choices of policing by the rich. And then they have to decide whether they're going to steal from the rich or not. So super quickly then, just sort of something that we've just been playing with, because again, sort of this is incredibly sort of preliminary. There is this kind of rational stealing. Stealing sort of makes sense for the poor when redistribution is lower than 70%. So in here, you can see that there is something like that, that the poor are more likely to steal from the rich when there has been low redistribution. This makes no difference to the rich. The rich are not more likely to invest in policing if there is a low level of redistribution. There is then a result that we can see here, which is stealing as a reaction to the other redistributive choice. So this is which redistribution rate was enforced? Was it you? Which would then reflect the fact that the actual redistribution that was enforced is exactly the one that you thought should be, or the other person, which is different from yours and therefore sort of would make things. And you can see that there is this big difference in the likelihood of stealing from the poor when it is the rich person that their choice about redistribution that has been enforced. And there is also an effect for policing, again, sort of much milder, having to do with the fact that the rich will be more likely to invest in policing if the choice of the poor is chosen, because there would be less, because that would mean sort of a higher level of redistribution than they chose themselves. All right. Again, this is very preliminary, and it's not only also very preliminary, but we do have sort of a general sort of set of questions about what would be one of the things that we are very aware of is that, of course, our crime and policing side of this is completely observational. Now, we're not really manipulating randomly the things that we think are going to affect the outcomes having to do with the choice of policing or stealing. So we think this is meaningful. We think this is really interesting. It is, in fact, something that we think we have not seen before. Do people make crime or policing choices that are clearly related to the levels of redistribution that they've chosen? But by doing that, we are moving away from the redistributive side of our analysis, in which you were put into a particular sort of treatment, effort, luck, effort, merit, and then that could be associated with a particular set of redistributive choices. Now what we're doing is that the experience of redistribution, the choices that you yourself made and the other opposite side made, is going to affect your crime or policing decisions. And therefore, we're not really sort of causally identifying these effects. I will stop there, and I will just again sort of mention that this is both in terms of our expectation to hopefully get money and run other sort of related but different experiments. Comments about that would be very useful. Comments about the things that we may be doing right or wrong, but also comments about how we can think about analyzing or illustrating some of the effects. There are many moving pieces here. It is a very sort of dense kind of project, and it is not sort of completely clear to us that we're succeeding in sort of simplifying things enough. Thank you very much.